Hello and welcome, I'm Tafaragdamo. An author, my guest today, Dr. Hesphina Rukato, at various times served at the African Union Commission and was also the Deputy CEO of NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development. Dr. Rukato, who has extensively written on African issues, joins me for a conversation on the challenges for development of the continent. Dr. Hesphina Rukato, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So what are the significant governance challenges that African countries face today, and how can they be addressed to create a more transparent and accountable leadership, you think?
For me, I think the major fundamental challenge is the disconnect between what we define as governance and the frameworks that have been developed under the leadership of the African Union and the practice of it. Because if you look at governance, for me, it should relate to how people are being governed. That includes political governance, that includes economic governance as well as social. But at the moment, the frameworks that we have that define governance purely on the basis of 5-yearly elections, and we call that democracy. For me, that is the biggest challenge that we have, because you can't have democracy.
But isn't that the basics?
For me, it's very fundamentally, when we say we've become democratic or a country is democratic, the example we give is that we had a free and fair election and therefore we're democratic. But for me, democracy should also mean economic democracy. Do people have access to the economy? Do people have access to service delivery? Do people have access to, or young people to education? For me, that is the practice of democracy. But I think we spend so much time defining it on the basis of when is the next election.
Okay, I know. We'll get back to some of the points you raised in relation to the economy and so on and so forth. But at the political level, don't African governments, these societies, in a way, need to play a very critical role along that line?
I think without participation in the key sectors of the economy by the people, there cannot be strong governance or relevant governance. Because at the end of the day, in most countries, when we talk of economic development, we talk of foreign direct investment, which means that most of the investments are by foreign investors. And there's always this thing that, oh, if you do something wrong, if you're corrupt, you scare off foreign investors, because we haven't grown our own private sector. As such, even if there's mining companies or companies in the agriculture sector, whatever profits they make, they don't stay in the country. They have to repatriate them. And that leaves the country or a member state of the African Union with only income from tax and royalties.
And people need to have a say in this process, right? And if that is the case, elections are the gateway to that, right?
Not necessarily.
In a way. Because
I think the challenge with that is that
but people are Go ahead.
The fundamentals of the Western models, who had already developed their economics to an extent that a political process doesn't change much in terms of people's access to the economy, because their institutions are already very strong, their people are already employed, and an election, no matter who wins, doesn't change the employment trajectory of young people, because the institutions and the rules are already there.
So how do you think the people, how could they be pulled into this process?
I think we need to change the direction of our economic development, because what I've seen on the ground is that if we could save certain finances or certain money to invest ourselves either as African private sector as SMMEs owned by women, owned by young people, the money stays within, and whatever money we get from our natural resources, for example, we then recapitalize to develop other sectors of the economy. But all the big industries, or most of the big industries, are not owned by local people. So it may look like there's economic growth rate, which is based on that kind of capital, which doesn't belong to our governments or nationally. It belongs from outside. So if they choose to close their mine for whatever reason, or their manufacturing factory for whatever reason, then it means all the people that were employed we have to be laid off. The fundamentals are not determined by national processes. So it's those national processes we need to define for ourselves, put them on paper, but then more importantly, implement them.
So can you explain a little more those national processes?
It's something that I've not seen anywhere, but I would say what is happening in Rwanda for me is a good example, where so many new institutions have been put in place. And I think the historical factor could be that the Rwandese had to start from scratch after 1994 or 1995, after the genocide. So there was no historical or legacy issues to have to deal with. They have to be innovative, creative, and not necessarily borrow from historical structures, which is the case in most African countries. The institutions that we are using are those that were there before independence. And even the thinking, some of the thinking.
So it can be defined in a different historical context, this Rwandan experience, and it would make it a little bit more difficult to replicate it elsewhere in the African continent, correct?
Exactly, because we still borrow, we still wait for advice from the IMF, we still wait for economic advice from the World Bank, even though we know historically what this has done to African countries in terms of structural adjustment policies and reducing issues of subsidies, social spending. We all know that impact, but we still depend on them for addressing our economic challenges.
But we have to partner with them. It's a necessity, is it not?
We don't have to. We can be more creative.
Like what?
Like, I'll give you an example that is collective for African heads of state. How many times do they go to the Africa Turkey Summit? Each one on their own plane with their own delegation. Not less than 30. They will go to China Africa Summit. They will go to UK Africa Summit. Can you imagine if we just use that as an example and say, this time we are not going. Let's save and calculate the money we are spending. And then we put it to building 3 schools or 3 clinics. For me, those are some of the examples.
But you're talking about addressing this issue at a micro level, are you not? I mean, whatever.
No, it's not at micro level.
From these trips are probably pretty paltry.
It's not. We can do a calculation of how much. It's not one AU delegation. It's 55 countries that sends a delegation to Turkey. Instead of saying, can we invite the Turkey head of state to come and talk to us during our own summit? So it's 55 countries, and multiply that by 5-year cycle of a head of state in office. How much does that come to? That is just one trip. There are others.
You raised a very important point, but we are looking outside of the continent for solutions, I guess. But if you look into what we have, into what we are dealing with within the continent, corruption looms high.
I don't think that I would still need to get the figures, and I'm not saying corruption is not relevant, but if we look, for example, at how many and how much resources we have, there's this thing that Africa is the richest continent in the world. Yes, there's corruption, but compared to the resources that leave the continent going to develop other countries, I don't think that is comparable. Yes, corruption is a problem. It needs to be addressed. But I don't think Africa is not developing because of corruption. It's because we're not using our own resources appropriately for Africans.
For Africans. Again, what measures need to be taken for Africans to make use of their natural resources, to tap into those resources?
My question to you, which will be rhetorical, is measures to be taken by who?
By
Because
Africans themselves.
by Africans, because the same people that are supposed to take those measures are largely the ones that are causing the problem. So my view then would be we need kind of social contracts that don't necessarily rely on one head of state's 5-year term in office, because each time we have an election and we say we're being democratic, that head of state will come in, want to develop their own new national development plan. So every 5 years, we are starting again. So we are never progressing. My view would be, let us have a situation whereby through national consultative processes, just like we do with referendums or other people deal with referendums, can we have a national development plan that will say, unless something fundamental happens to nation state B, no matter which head of state comes, this is the program of the people for the next 15 to 20 years.
How realistic is that?
For me, but we have to break boundaries. We have never developed before, but we place limitations on ourselves because it's almost like we're afraid of succeeding. But it's very realistic. We have to be innovative and do what we've never done before. But because we keep repeating the same method and we get the same result, we're waiting for a miracle.
Let's take, for example, industrialization. How is it faring within the African continent in light of what you just said?
I think some countries are doing better than others, but on average, I think we're doing very poorly because I'll give an example of, let's say, the textile, because that's an industry where I am also interested in. We grow cotton in Africa. We export it as a raw material. Then we all go to China to buy dresses. Or they come back to us as imports. Yet we are talking industrialization. How does that work? Or even the issue of secondhand clothing. If you recall, there was an issue of Rwanda saying we're banning secondhand clothing because we also want the importation of secondhand clothing because we want to also grow our own textile industry. So just by way of saying, are we expecting miracles when in practice we are doing something that we know will not industrialize the continent?
So I'm
with minerals.
Just curious. Yeah, well, go ahead.
Same with minerals. We do the same. Refineries are not in our countries. Oil is the same.
So it's not that complicated. Yes, of course, that's where I was aiming at. I mean, we have quite a sizable young population that is trainable and so on.
Yes, but I think we need to look at it as a package because the reason why we don't, one of the reasons why we don't add value to our products, even though we talk about it at every summit, every ministerial, every senior officials meeting, is that we separate industrialization from skills development and education and the curriculum that we teach our kids at school. In as much as we say everybody's talking about, our youth is the continent's dividend. But how dividend are they if they did theology at university and you need to value add to your minerals? The Minister of Education is not talking to the Minister of Mining, and the Minister of Mining is not talking to the Minister of Energy, and the Minister of Energy is not talking to the Minister of Water, and we therefore are having too many parallel paths, but they never join to industrialization.
This is beyond policies and so on and so forth, right?
It's beyond. is beyond. How do we sequence things? What must happen first? But we do everything at the same time. We are busy, but we don't yield results. Money is spent every year, every month on a civil service that's not delivering to the public.
Are we being gender sensitive in all those interventions?
I think on paper, yes, every politician will stand up and say, oh, we'll put women first, or we'll put youth first. But for example, if you look now, just at a political level, I was looking at the candidates for the chairperson of the AU Commission. From East Africa only, 4 candidates. It's not so young males. There's no one woman, there's no one young person. But we say we're so committed to gender, to women in leadership, we're committed to young people in leadership. If you look at the 55 member states, only one woman is a head of state, Tanzania.
Why do you
and
think?
Historically, I think it's things that happen at the national level, where I think it is still as male space. Politics is still seen as male space, because even as we talk on paper and write in paper, in practice, the environment is not very conducive to women, especially young women, to participate in. The hurdles at that level, at the national level, or even at the local level. So when you don't have them in parliament at the local level, it means you can't have them as ministers. If party politics doesn't address the issue of gender, then I think we will not go anywhere. We may need to institute a situation like the AU has done to say 50-50. We should have a requirement that says every member state cabinet must be 50-50. So then it will force them up downstream to say, for us to have 50 cabinet ministers, it means we must have 50% MPs that are female, which means your campaign is already going to include women. We must also put a percentage for youth, for young people.
Can you think you can make a difference by instituting a piece of legislation? Just by doing that?
At the AU level, it happened, where we are not going to elect 6 men out of the 10 commissioners. We are going to elect only 5 men and 5 women. And it was difficult at first. I understand 2002, some of the regional economic communities or the regions would come and say, we could not find a suitable woman. It's like, no, just as much as we find poorly performing men, let's also then just put poorly performing women. So everybody has a chance to fail. That's
interesting. So I'd like you to reflect on the state of peace and security on the continent. I know that you've been observing developments since when? About 20 plus years back.
Yeah.
In relation to all these things that you've been talking about in terms of economic development, political evolution, and so on and so forth.
Peace and security is the people. My view is that the current peace and security situation, which is not very good, and it keeps not getting better, is related to the whole economic issue and the fact that the majority of the people are unhappy politically, economically, and socially. And it's not because they're lazy. It's just that the situation, as it is promised, that we're going to be developed. Every manifesto comes, we're promising this, those things don't happen. But also, the situation of peace and security in Africa is not, Africa is the playground, even because some of the reasons for conflict are not necessarily caused by the African situation, because other players as well, they're interested in getting the most they can out of the continent. And as long as there's good governance, it becomes difficult. I think it is easier to plunder in a time of conflict because no one is held accountable. We all knew about the blood diamonds in Sierra Leone when there was civil strife, And then people will say, for private sector to come in, you need to have elections, you need to have this. But in DRC, it's actually, they are going in for the minerals even when there's social strife. So I think there's need for an integrated approach to our peace and security situation and address the root causes, not the symptoms. Because how many countries in Africa manufacture guns? So where are the guns coming from that kill the people? And we say we want to silence the guns, but Africa's problems is not about the guns, it's the economics. Empower people economically, they will not protest. We saw recently protests in Kenya, protests in Nigeria. It's not about the guns. It's the guns of the bullets that are in the stomach when people are hungry. We see young people crossing the seas, endangering themselves, and thousands dying. They are not running away from guns. Some of them, yes, they are refugees where guns have exploded, but most of them, the main war is on hunger and poverty.
Well, with that, I guess we need to end the conversation. Thank you very much, Hesphina Rukato, for your insights into those issues. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.